Take a network break. I'm Drew Conry Murray.
And I'm Jonna Johnson.
Help yourself to a virtual donut as we swan dive into the pool of this week's tech news. Jonna, what's on the menu?
Well, I'd rather swan dive than belly flop, Drew, but we've got a surprise announcement by the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, regarding the HPE-Juniper merger. Some news on the DeepSeek kerfluffle that many of you have heard about, a round of market earnings, and more.
Yeah, before we get into that, just a reminder that the Network Automation Forum's AutoCon conference wants to hear from you. There's an open call for speakers and an open call for workshops for AutoCon 3, which is taking place this May in Prague. If you've got a network automation case study to share or a story to tell or a workshop you'd like to teach, go to networkautomation.forum and look for the AutoCon 3 event to pitch your idea. That is networkautomation.forum. And we hope to see you in Prague. It's a great conference. And they love to get real world stories. So if you've got something to share, go suggest it. John, let's dive into Red Alerts.
Yes, but if you don't have anything to share, I will just add, maybe you should think of something because Prague is amazing. You will love it, particularly in May.
I am looking forward to it.
Okay. Well, first off, there's a slap in the face for Apple Silicon. Of the 952, yes, almost 1,000 CVEs this week, 52 have a CVSS score of 9.5 or more. Luckily for you, we're not going to go through all 52, but we are going to pick some from the 4 with 10s. Actually, we're not going to pick any of them. We are going to call attention to the new Spectre-style information leakage attacks that have been demonstrated by researchers against Apple Silicon. There isn't a CVE yet, but the researchers call this slap and flop. Yes, they're clever acronyms. These attacks exploit weaknesses in various aspects of speculative execution and data retrieval functionality in the Apple processors themselves. They allow code running in a web page to retrieve information, and get this, including credentials left behind in a processor's cache and its quote-unquote micro-architectural state by other processes in other tabs, even processes that have already terminated. And here's the fun part. There are no patches as yet at the browser or the OS level. So our recommendation is practice good hygiene, like keeping your OS and browsers up to date. We suggest strongly not to use Safari. You are probably a lot better using Firefox because that does not have the vulnerability. And oh, by the way, try to separate work and business from recreational browsing and using separate browsers, which is always good practice anyway.
Right.
And oh, by the way, if you can do it, use anonymous, private, incognito browsing windows to isolate browser processes from each other even more. Sadly, changes in this kind of practice aren't going to significantly remove the risk entirely, but it can reduce it significantly.
So are there any known active exploits or suspected exploits? Are you aware of any?
Not yet, but give it time now that it's been published.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. So just a reminder, there are still 4 CVEs with 10s, and we'll talk about a few high-level CVEs as well, and 52 with 9.5. So in addition to this, if we haven't scared you enough, please go check out the CVEs and see if any of them apply to you.
Yeah. Yeah, this kind of attack is scary because it's not just updating application or OS software. You have to get right into the hardware itself. And then that means maybe even replacing hardware, or at least having to fiddle around with hardware updates, which are can be difficult. So scary.
Yeah, and on top of that, it's also those of us who use, Apple products have always been kind of smug
A
about
little smug.
yeah, we're safe. And it's like, well, maybe not so safe.
Yeah.
So it's a come to earth moment for many of us. Speaking of those CVEs, there were 5 more of them for Broadcom's VMware. Broadcom has announced patches for a string of high severity vulnerabilities in its ARIA operations for logs, and Cloud Foundation products. These are, again, 5 CVEs associated with this alert that address several issues, which would let, according to VMware, a malicious actor with view-only admin permissions give them the ability to read the credentials of a VMware product integrated with VMware ARIA operations for logs. And then there are other CVEs that address cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, including one that would let someone with non-admin privileges escalate to an admin user, always fun, and run arbitrary operations.
Yeah.
We've got links in the show notes, so please, if you are running ARIA, please have a look with this and implement those patches as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think the big thing here is that it's not any one of these CVEs that are particularly dangerous, but the collection of them makes this a significant issue. And we know there's a lot of VMware customers out there, so something to pay attention to.
Absolutely.
Let's get into the news. And of course, the big story this week is that the U.S. Department of Justice has filed a suit to block the merger of HPE and Juniper Networks. HPE and Juniper had forecast a close of the acquisition in early 2025, and they'd also cleared all of the regulatory hurdles from other countries. So this suit is something of a surprise for the companies and, frankly, I think the IT industry. The Department of Justice is arguing that if the merger went through, two companies would control 70% of the market. That is Cisco, and then the combined HPE and Juniper controlling 70% of the WLAN market. The Department of Justice argues that this concentration of market power would lessen competition in the WLAN market. John, I've got some feelings about this argument, but I want to get your take first.
Yeah, I guess my reaction is when you said it sort of surprised many of us in the IT industry, that would include me, because I really don't see the logic for opposing this. Yes, it does create a duopoly out of a triopoly or whatever you call it, but it actually gives enterprise consumers a credible option to Cisco, which is bigger than the current option that they have. So I don't see how a duopoly is necessarily bad in this scenario. Maybe this is because I'm not a lawyer. And I'm just a technical person.
Yeah, the issue, you say duopoly, which makes it sound like they are of equal size.
Right.
But that's not the case. Cisco and the Justice Department lawsuit even says that Cisco is by far the largest vendor and is more than twice as large as the next largest competitor, HPE. And there are market stats from folks like Deloro who put Cisco at about 50% market share in North America. HPE has about 12 to 13%, and Juniper has about 8%. So when they say duopoly, it's like, well, okay, but it's one giant duopoly. And then if you even combined HPE and Juniper, they're still less than half the market share of Cisco. So this argument that you're going to reduce competition, I don't think really stands.
Yeah, and I think it has to do, and let me spell this out a bit more explicitly what I'm thinking. The issue, it's not like, it's not like they're selling beans or bolts or widgets. The issue is that in order to compete, to have a credible alternative to Cisco, you need products that actually integrate well together and can be managed as a common infrastructure, which you're not going to get by buying them from two separate companies. So 1 + 1 = more than 2 in this scenario, in a way, because essentially what you've done is create a viable competitor to Cisco out of a non-viable competitor to Cisco. So in my book, that means you're creating a more competitive marketplace, because people who don't want Cisco now have HPE plus Juniper as an option, whereas HPE separately and Juniper separately is not an option. Not as powerful as an option, I should say, because it requires more manual integration. So it actually balances the scales and levels the playing field in a way that the DOJ is claiming it does not. So I guess the reason I sort of stumbled a bit at the beginning of this is the logic doesn't hold. And yes, you can say, oh, okay, we're going to move from one large competitor and a bunch of smaller competitors to two larger competitors, but it doesn't work that way in the tech space.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so HPE and Juniper released a statement saying they were going to fight the suit in court. So we'll have to see how this shakes out. And the fact that this came out with the entrance of a new administration, this is just paranoid political me asking, is this maybe a shakedown by the Trump administration? It's a dark prospect, and I don't want to give too much credence to that idea. But I also just can't help wondering a little bit, because this just seems to have come out of nowhere. And because the logic is so bad.
Yeah, I mean, there really isn't any credible logic. It's just, putting words on paper to make a point. I don't know. I guess we'll have to see, and fingers crossed. Meanwhile, I believe Juniper actually had a fairly good year, if memory serves. So there is that. Moving right ahead to illogic in action, DeepSeek apparently shook the universe this past week by releasing its version 3 LLM, resulting in enormous fear and loathing in the financial markets, tanking NVIDIA's stock because essentially they were claiming that they can operate on a fraction of the power and a fraction of the computing power requirements. This is bonkers, because even the premier of China said, oh, hey, we basically developed this using open source software and publicly published research papers. So it's not like there was this deep investment that suddenly bloomed. And, oh, by the way, people who are driving NVIDIA's stock up and down like crazy people should really just stop and think, look, the company makes chips. These are important chips that people need. it's a strong market. NVIDIA is sold out through the remainder of this year. So going up and down by 20% makes no sense based on what one reverse engineered tool in China can do. Now we're seeing that folks are starting to calm down enough to realize that rather than destroy the market for NVIDIA chips or even leaving the leading AI lights in the dust, the eventual outcome is probably going to be to broaden NVIDIA's market to companies with pockets not quite as deep as Alphabet's and Meta's. This is good news for NVIDIA and good news for the rest of us. In the meantime, DeepSeek is now reporting that the public-facing service built around the model is facing some kind of large-scale malicious attack of some sort, and therefore it will be limiting new user registrations as a result. Well, maybe there's an attack, and maybe that's just what they're saying because it doesn't actually handle the scale. One way or the other, that's what's going on. I also think, by the way, I will just toss in a word of warning. I think it's a terrible idea for anyone to be using the Chinese version of DeepSeek because you are simply handing over your data to the Chinese government. If you're a Chinese national, that's fine. Go for it because they have all your data anyway. Might as well use your tool. If you are not, I am not anti-China, but China has regulations in place that are very, very aggressive when it comes to the use of data that by any Chinese system. So you are making a huge mistake if you personally or your enterprise organization is using this tool in any way, shape, or form. Cheap and free are not necessarily cheap and free in the long run.
Yeah, I think what happened was kind of two things. One, we've seen companies like OpenAI and Sam Altman saying things like, we're going to need to invest $7 trillion to develop AI. And then Project Stargate was announced, which was a $500 billion investment. And they're, pulling in VCs and investors to build out this amazing AI infrastructure. And then a company comes along and says, we did it for $5 million on chips that aren't even state of the art because of export controls. We couldn't even use state of the art, and look what we did. So it sort of blew a hole in this argument that we need to be spending tons and tons and tons and tons of money. One, to build up our infrastructure, and two, part of the reason they're saying we need to build up this infrastructure is we got to beat China. And then China walks in with the DeepSeek, which by all of the accounts I've read works pretty good as a reasoning model, considering the restrictions they were working under. So it just sort of cut out a lot of that argument. And then also watching NVIDIA's stock crater as investors are like, oh my God, what does this mean for NVIDIA? And that huge panic. I think hats off to the CEO of NVIDIA who was like, everybody calm down, it's going to be fine. I think it was smart of him.
Absolutely. Although I have to admit, there's some karma in this because about 3 weeks ago, he stood up and said, I don't think quantum computing is going to happen for another 30 years and managed to tank all the quantum computing stocks, which was hilarious. I actually was on at the opening of the New York Stock Exchange being interviewed as a quote unquote thought leader on this, and basically said, look, he's wrong on that point, but also people relax. Stocks should not go up and down like this. The fundamentals are the fundamentals, so stop paying so much attention to any one event. So I think that's basically, if you're an investor listening to this, that's the message. Calm down. It's going to be fine. And I would also say, the whole thing about being able to do DeepSeek on $5 million made me think of the old joke in the United States about how engineers don't want to be working for NASA because it doesn't push their ingenuity. Because if you worked for NASA, you could walk in and say, I need this thing, and it costs $1 million, and they got you that thing. So so you got lazy. Whereas if you were working someplace that had no money, it's like, how do you figure out how to solve this problem? And your engineering juices would begin to flow. So I have to say hats off to the Chinese for fully utilizing their engineering talent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Moving right along, Broadcom has now claimed the first quantum-safe Fibre Channel controllers. On January 28th, Broadcom premiered its Emulex secure Fibre Channel host bus adapters that encrypt all data moving between servers and storage with, quote, quantum-resistant cryptographic algorithms that are in compliance with the NSA's Commercial National Security Algorithm Suite 2.0. That is the second attempt at quantum-proof encryption. By encrypting at the network level, the solution allows applications running on the servers to continue to take advantage of the storage array services that application-level encryption interferes with, such as deduplication and compression. It can also allow for real-time ransomware detection, which is actually very cool, based on storage traffic where application-based encryption can hide it. The adapter approach also offloads the processing hit for encryption and decryption from the CPU, so it's all around a good thing. So if the quantum resistant part doesn't get yet, at least the ransomware detection should, as well as the performance benefits.
So question, this commercial national security algorithm suite 2.0 CNSA, is that the same as the NIST algorithms that came out, or are these a separate suite of algorithms?
I believe they are the same as the NIST, but don't quote me on that.
Okay.
Because the NSA has been sort of squiggy about that, and certainly we can follow up on that on next week's episode. But the NSA has been a little bit squiggy about which algorithms should be used and which shouldn't, so I can't be 100% certain.
And I'm just going to tap into my inner Greg Farrow and be a little snarky and say the Fibre Channel folks were like, woohoo, we can attach quantum computing to our product. Yay.
Well, that's actually not what it says, though. It is literally, we're just protecting the network. Because remember, the issue is that cryptographically relevant quantum computing is around the corner, at least according to the U.S. OMB, Office of Management and Budget. It's somewhere between now and 2030. And so essentially what can happen is you can put something like, I don't know, Salt Typhoon on any network system, capturing tons of data and then decrypt it later. So it's not really about putting quantum computing at either end. It's really about making sure that that link cannot allow for data to be captured and decrypted downstream.
Yes. Yeah, I get that. It's just, there's not a lot to say about Fibre Channel. So
Exactly. Fibre Channel is not the leading technology, but hey,
right.
any, rising tide lifts all boats, right? Or something like that.
Yes, and certainly being able to attach quantum-resistant cryptographic algorithms to Fibre Channel gives you an excuse to roll out a press release. So, but if you need it, you need it. So that's good. Moving on, we've been talking about nefarious activities or potentially nefarious activities in the Baltic regarding subsea fiber optic cables. And it's getting a little bit more serious. On the morning of January 26th, Swedish forces seized a Bulgarian cargo ship called Vezen. My Bulgarian is not up to date, in the belief that those aboard sabotaged a telecom cable belonging to Latvian State Radio and Television running under the Baltic between Latvia and Sweden, where governments in the region have become more alert and responsive to threats and damage to subsea cables. Since two others, these are under the Gulf of Finland, were damaged under suspicious circumstances around Christmas Day. Many of the NATO governments, I think, believe such incidents are attached to low-intensity, non-military forms of warfare under the direction of the Kremlin.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense because it just seems really weird that all these fishermen got suddenly very, very clumsy in the space of about 6 weeks.
Right. One report I read is that they were dragging their anchor for hundreds of miles, which if you're a boat, that's the worst thing you could do. So a little suspicious activity there.
Exactly. And I just want to remind everybody that the whole idea of this low intensity non-military form of warfare also applies to nation state cyber warfare, because the beauty of it is you can claim it or not, depending on whether it's politically advantageous to claim it or not. And
exactly.
that, unlike a missile, it's sort of like, well, if you fire a missile, that kind of looks like an act of war. That gives you more flexibility in your positioning. And, certainly cybersecurity attacks are cheaper. I don't know what it costs to drag your anchor for hundreds of miles. It's probably not entirely cheap, but low cost. But nonetheless, it still gives the warring parties greater flexibility. So it's certainly not out of the question that that's the case. And I don't think anyone's being paranoid by charging that.
No, not at all. And I think it's good for... These cables carry a lot of information. They are, in some ways, I guess not lifelines, that may be overstating it, but essential connections to the rest of the world for business, for communication, and so on. They are an asset. They are a target. And so I think it makes sense to be paying more attention to them.
Okay, and moving along to clever engineering that costs almost nothing and saves big. There's a clever change to network management that allows much more power efficient Linux. Actually, by much more, we mean a reduction by about 30% of power consumption. Turns out that a code update to Linux may make the operating system significantly more power efficient. Researchers at Ontario's University of Waterloo discovered back in 2023 that network management in the Linux kernel could be made more efficient by allowing it to switch back and forth more fluidly between being interrupt-driven and polling-driven. One of the researchers, named Martin Karsten, with help from an engineer at Fastly, Joe D'Amato, crafted a 30-line bit of code to add to the kernel, allowing its admins to control the balance between polling and interrupt modes via system configs. Now, that new code has been released as part of Linux kernel 6.13 on January 19th.
You made it to the kernel.
It made it to the kernel, allows the operating system to be more efficient, and with typical modern workloads, such as hosts that run only a few major applications rather than lots of small applications, can potentially reduce energy consumption by up to 30%.
Wow.
So if you're a developer, you may want to make sure that your network drivers have been updated to take advantage of this. It's good to know about, and it's always fun to see, a lightweight change over here, make it into production over there.
Yeah, 30 lines of code, that's not bad to get 30% savings. And we know power is becoming an increasingly serious issue for data center operators. So that kind of savings could be substantial.
Absolutely.
Pivoting back to Wi-Fi, the wireless LAN market is expected to grow 11% in 2025. That's according to research from the Dell'Oro Group. That growth is going to be driven by the adoption of Wi-Fi 7, which is the newest standard. Wi-Fi 7 benefits include MLO, or multi-link operation, which lets devices use multiple bands simultaneously to increase throughput and reduce latency. Wi-Fi 7 also supports wider channels. You can just stuff more in there. 11% growth for 2025 is good, but there are potential hurdles beyond that. I talked with Sean Morgan, research director at Dell'Oro. She noted that China is a huge driver of the WLAN market globally. So if China's economy falters, that could drive down global growth. Here in the US, there's a couple of unknowns that could also affect WLAN growth. First, while some big name companies are demanding a full return to office, there's also evidence that office footprints are shrinking, which means you need fewer APs, which has a knock-on effect on the WLAN market. Another issue she raised is that, if the Trump administration slashes federal spending, that could have a significant impact on areas like the K-12 industry or the K-12 sector, which rely on federal dollars for infrastructure upgrades. Tariff wars could also lead to price spikes or just market uncertainty, which could also hamper growth.
And by the way, Drew, one of the reasons I think you're great is because you stop and correct yourself, K-12, market sector, not industry, because being an engineer, one has to be accurate.
I appreciate that.
So, yeah. I do think I agree with everything the Dell'Oro Group says. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Dell'Oro Group, they're pretty much the gold standard market researcher in the networking space. So, on to some fun news. Well, entertaining to some of us. Microsoft 365 admins were locked out of admin portal for hours. On the 29th, from at least 11:45 a.m. to 2:45 p.m. Eastern, customers administrators were unable to get into the Microsoft 365 admin center.
Oops.
Some other services, such as search within Exchange, were also affected. Microsoft indicated in the admin center status messages after the problem was fixed, we identified a recent configuration change that contained an error, which prevented access requests from completing as expected. We reverted this change, and after a period of extended monitoring, we've confirmed the issue is resolved for all users. No explanation was provided as to how the erroneous configuration got put through, but we know Microsoft has challenges with that kind of thing.
Yeah, locking your customers out of their admin portal is not a great look. That counts as an outage in my book, I guess.
But Drew, it doesn't seem to have hurt their finances because they just announced their Q2 fiscal year 2025 results.
Well, yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that. Microsoft reported their financial results for Q2 fiscal 2025. For the quarter, revenues were $69.6 billion, up 12% versus this time last year, with net income of $24 billion, up 10%. By sector, its productivity BU, which includes Microsoft 365, brought in $29.4 billion. Intelligent Cloud, that includes Azure, earned $25.5 billion, up 19%. Personal computing brought in $14.7 billion. I will note, though, that despite those numbers, shares fell 4.5% after the earnings release, in part because of Microsoft forecasting lower Azure growth than Wall Street wants, and Azure missing Wall Street expectations in the current quarter. A big concern for investors is whether Microsoft is going to see commensurate returns on the billions that it's spending on AI infrastructure. Any thoughts there, Jonna?
I think that is a challenge, but I would, as much as I like to bang on Microsoft, I do think that Microsoft is doing a great job with its investments both in AI and quantum. And I think the problem is that those are going to be longer term returns, and Wall Street hates longer term. If it's after lunch, it's too far out.
Yes.
So, I think once again, what were we saying at the very beginning? Like, calm down, people, stop being so dramatic. That would apply here. I think the questioning whether Microsoft will see commensurate returns on the billions it's spending, it's a legitimate question to ask, but the company's track record is extremely good at making these kinds of technology pivots quickly and well. If you look at, all the way back when the internet emerged, Microsoft was sort of watching and waiting and finally came out with its own browser and then ended up dominating. Same thing, it pivoted when the world turned to cloud. I don't think it's going to screw up noticeably badly on AI or quantum, which are the next two kind of planes lined up on the runway, so to speak. It just may not happen as fast as Wall Street wants, and that's Wall Street's problem, I guess.
Well, yeah, here's the scrutiny that Wall Street is holding Microsoft to. Reuters notes that Azure grew revenues by 31% in Q2, just in Q2, 31%, but Wall Street consensus was for 31.8%. And so since they missed by 0.8, that counts as a miss. And, frankly, I kind of sympathize with the frustration Microsoft must feel about that share dip. Like, publicly traded companies would kill for a quarter with 31% revenue growth, but you missed the target by 8% and somebody's going to scold you for that. I'd be like, "Whirr."
And it's not even a target you yourself set. I mean, that's the other thing.
Yeah,
Wall
that's
Street,
an external target. Yeah.
Right. It's sort of like, hey, Drew, I think you can do 57 push-ups and you do 56. Like, where does this even come from?
Why are you telling me how many push-ups I should do?
Exactly.
I sort of also wonder if, DeepSeek entering the chat also made Wall Street a little bit more grumpy, seeing as, again, billions and billions and billions being spent, and then a cheaper alternative pops up out of nowhere. Maybe not out of nowhere, but again, we talked about this earlier, that all of this money being invested, what are we going to get out of it? Can it be done more cheaply?
Yeah, I think that's probably the most relevant point, because Wall Street hates nothing more than surprises that it can view as negative.
Yes.
And so I guess we could just say this particular, stock dip was just collateral damage from DeepSeek for the moment. And possibly, if anyone has a memory that long, also back from NVIDIA CEO's comments about quantum, which sort of would depress the thinking that, hey, Microsoft is investing heavily in quantum, maybe they shouldn't be, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, et cetera.
So with that. Moving on to some more financial results. Intel reports its Q4 and full year financial results. For the quarter, Intel had revenues of $14.3 billion, down 7%. For the quarter, the company had a net loss of $100 million. Not a good thing. For the full year, revenues were $53.1 billion, down 2% year over year, with a net loss of almost $19 billion. So we're seeing kind of accelerating losses, not a good thing.
Yeah.
Looking at Intel's business units, the Client Computing Group's revenues were down 9% for the quarter. Data Center and AI was down 3%. The only bright spot here is its Network and Edge business, which was up 10%, but on very small numbers, revenues being only $1.6 billion for this business unit.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and the CEO search also continues. I looked at the earnings call transcript to see if any of the analysts would ask the current co-CEOs about that search. It didn't really come up. And frankly, I have to say, looking at the dynamic between the two current co-CEOs, they seem to have a nice rhythm. They seem to work well together. So maybe there's not a lot of pressure to get a full CEO in place, or at least not an immediate pressure. So we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, and it's also the case that a lot of Intel's future is tied up with grants and investments from the U.S. government, which may or may not be forthcoming with the new administration in town, since the administration has vowed to cut down on quote-unquote government waste, which may include investing in companies not owned by Elon Musk.
Yeah, so in the earnings call transcript, an analyst did ask about that. So they basically were like, what's your relationship with the new administration? The co-CEO said they feel like they have a good engagement with the Trump administration, and they were also saying that they believe the Intel strategy of onshoring more chip manufacturing and growing jobs should align with the administration that says it wants more U.S. jobs. So we'll see.
We'll see. That's a delightfully hopeful take on things. Let me just leave it at that.
That's my genius level take. We'll see.
Well, we'll see. All right. So just wrapping things up. Speaking of things that are not surprising but pleasant. What about Checkpoint's full year results and Q4 results?
Yeah, Checkpoint announced financial results for Q4 and full year. For the quarter, Checkpoint had revenues of $704 million, up 6% year over year, and a net income of $257.5 million. For the full year, revenues were $2.5 billion, also up 6% year over year on a net income of $845 million. So I don't have a lot to say here. It seems like Checkpoint seems to be doing fine. The security market spending seems to be robust, and they are benefiting.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not like big numbers like some of the numbers we were quoting before, but they're trending up, so that's all you need to know.
That's right. Well, that wraps up the news, and we don't have a Tech Bite, so that's it. John, if folks want to find you online, where should they go?
They can hit me up on LinkedIn or at nemertes.com. That's NEMERTES.com. I'd love to hear from you.
All right. I'm Drew Conrad Murray. I'm on Blue Sky at DrewCM and blogging at packetpushers.net. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Network Break. If you like the show, you could leave a recommendation on Apple Podcasts or share a link with your friends. And if you have comments, corrections, kudos, anything else, you can always hit us up at packetpushers.net/FU. We take all follow-up seriously, so please do reach out. Thanks for listening.